Today we're going to talk about the Heart Sutra, which scholar Donald Lopez calls perhaps the most famous Buddhist scripture. As well, the translator and scholar Red Pine had this to say. He says, "The Heart Sutra is Buddhism in a nutshell. It covers more of the Buddha's teachings in a shorter span than any other scripture." Now this is, of course, a huge topic, and I can only do a bare sketch here using a limited number of scholarly references. But what I want to do in this video is first to give something of a historical picture, a sketch of the Heart Sutra and its place in Buddhism. Then I'm going to read the text. It's short enough that I can read it in a couple of minutes here, at least so we have some background about what exactly we're talking about. And then what I want to do is use some of the early commentaries as a window on how we interpret the major portions of the text and what it's trying to tell us. That is to say, use some of the ancient commentators to figure out what the text really wants to say. And as always, I'll be leaving the references down in the notes below. Now, it's unclear who composed the text first, or even where it was composed, and even dating it is something of an issue. The great Japanese scholar Hajime Nakamura has it around the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The scholar Edward Conze has it somewhere around the 4th century of the Common Era. There are various clues that the text is relatively late. First of all, there seem to be, the text seems to encapsulate fissures between the Mahayana, of which the text is a part, and other forms of Buddhism, in that the main protagonist of the text is a celestial bodhisattva rather than one of, let's say, the disciples of the Buddha, as would have been the case with prior kinds of sutras. Also, the use of Avalokiteshvara as this main protagonist is somewhat unusual. Avalokiteshvara is a bodhisattva who only really began to appear in Mahayana sutras around the 2nd century of the Common Era. Now, the sutra as we see it today is largely a summary of what is known as the Prajnaparamita literature, which is some of the first literature in the Mahayana canon, which began somewhere, that is to say, the Prajnaparamita literature began somewhere around the 1st century before the Common Era. And the use of the term heart in the title, Heart Sutra, doesn't mean compassion or love in the sort of modern Western sense, but is used in the sense of the essence or heart, the central part of the teaching. Red Pine believes that this is intended to be an echo of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma texts, certain early Sarvastivada Abhidharma texts, which use the same kind of title in some of their texts to denote the essence of their teaching. And we'll get to a little bit of that later on. Prajnaparamita, by the way, means the perfection of wisdom. And this is the important part here, is that we're going to be dealing with this perfection of wisdom. So the title Heart Sutra basically can be taken to mean essence of the perfection of wisdom. Now, the text exists in a couple of forms, or several forms, the most famous of which, the most important of which, are sort of a shorter form and a longer form. In today's video, I'll be dealing exclusively with the shorter form. Scholars believe it's probably the earlier one of the two, and it's obviously easier to deal with because it's somewhat shorter. Now, there is also some scholarly dispute on whether this text was composed in Chinese first and then back translated into Sanskrit, or whether it was first composed in Sanskrit and then translated into Chinese. I'm not going to get into that particular controversy in this video. There are plenty of papers that argue one side or the other of that, and I'll leave you to try to hash that out on your own. So what does the Heart Sutra say? Well, to make this a little bit simpler for us, I've split this into 5 different paragraphs or sections. Here I'm going off of the translation by Red Pine, with my own formatting and titles for each of these separate sections or paragraphs. So we begin with the introduction. The noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, while practicing the deep practice of Prajnaparamita, looked upon the 5 skandhas, and seeing they were empty of self-existence, said, "Here, Shariputra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness is form." The same holds for sensation and perception, memory and consciousness. Here, Shariputra, all dharmas are defined by emptiness, not birth or destruction, purity or defilement, completeness or deficiency. The third paragraph, we have the first result here. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no memory, and no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, and no mind. No shape, no sound, no smell, no taste, no feeling, and no thought. No element of perception from eye to conceptual consciousness. No causal link from ignorance to old age and death, and no end of causal link from ignorance to old age and death. No suffering, no source, no relief, no path. No knowledge, no attainment, and no non-attainment. Then the second result. Therefore, Shariputra, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in prajna paramita and live without walls of the mind. Without walls of the mind and thus without fears, they see through delusions and finally nirvana. All Buddhas, past, present, and future, also take refuge in prajna paramita and realize unexcelled, perfect enlightenment. Finally, the mantra. You should therefore know the great mantra of prajna paramita, the mantra of great magic, the unexcelled mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, which heals all suffering and is true, not false. The mantra in prajna paramita, spoken thus, gate gate paragate, parasangate bodhi swaha.
So what does this text really say to us? Now, it's eminently possible for us to approach this sort of from a position of faith, that is, simply a beginner's mind reveling in the kind of weirdness, these strange paradoxes and apparent contradictions that flow from the text over and over. And I think I would submit that that's probably the way most of us approach this text, as a kind of a wonderful collection of paradoxes that stimulate the mind. And that's probably, indeed, what helped make it a famous text. But what I want to do in this video is go a bit deeper and look at some of the early commentators on this text, some early Buddhist commentators, to find out how they interpreted the text in detail. Because what we're dealing with here essentially is a very compressed summary of a great deal of information, again, from this prajna paramita literature. This is intended to be a summary, so what is it summarizing? What is it trying to tell us? So we can begin with the introductory section. And this section is really, we might say, the essence or heart of the Heart Sutra. It's the most important section in many ways. We can tell here that this section begins with this celestial bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, who is claiming to explain the deep practice of prajna paramita to Shariputra or Sariputta, who was the Buddha's right-hand disciple, who the Buddha himself claimed to be foremost in wisdom. So what we see here is a text that purports to give us the perfection of wisdom being explained to the Buddha's disciple who was the foremost in wisdom. Sariputta also is lauded or understood to be sort of the father of what's known as the Abhidharma. Now, historically that's not really accurate. The Abhidharma probably post-dated Sariputra by decades, if not centuries. That was a later development, but nevertheless, since he was so wise and in the sutras is known for organizing and collating a lot of the Buddhist Dharma, he's understood to be the father of, again, this Abhidharma. Now, what exactly is the Abhidharma? I'll get to that in a minute. But before I even get there, why are we discussing the Abhidharma at all? After all, this text that I've just read, the Heart Sutra, never mentions the Abhidharma. And yet it does, very explicitly in the opening paragraph. It mentions that the 5 aggregates were empty of self-existence. That is what Avalokiteshvara saw.
So what is this self-existence? This is a translation of a term from the Abhidharma, svabhava, meaning own being or self-existence. So what is the Abhidharma then? The Abhidharma is basically an attempt to collate and formalize the teachings of the Buddha as they were presented in the suttas and the sutras. In the suttas, the Buddha basically discusses his philosophy, the Dharma, in a number of discourses, but it's all higgledy-piggledy, it's not organized. So what the Abhidharmikas, what the people did when they formulated the Abhidharma was to try to, for example, look for all of the terms that the Buddha used and try to define them all, and try to pin them down and try to organize them into lists and into a sort of a general understanding of what the Dharma was in a structural sense. And this classification of these terms and ideas that the Buddha used then came to be understood as what are known as dharmas, in the technical sense, of irreducible aspects of reality. Now, what are examples of these? Some examples might be the 5 skandhas, or 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates into which the human person is dissolved. That is, form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. Each of these 5 was understood to be a dharma, or a group of dharmas that were themselves irreducible, that had a certain kind of permanent essence to what they were. This permanent essence made each of these dharmas what it was in all 3 times, that is, in the past, present, and future. This particular metaphysical or ontological understanding is the hallmark of one of the most famous early Buddhist schools, known as the Sarvastivada school, that existed from, roughly speaking, the 3rd century before the Common Era until the 7th century of the Common Era, or roughly 1,000 years. And in translator Red Pine's view, which is not atypical by any means, the Heart Sutra in specific, and arguably the Prajnaparamita literature generally, was written in opposition to this Sarvastivada Abhidharma. So the Heart Sutra begins right at the start with a bang by saying that Avalokiteshvara saw that these khandhas, these aggregates, were empty of self-existence. So right at the start we have an immediate rejection of the Sarvastivada Abhidharma. And the rest of the Heart Sutra is basically looking at all the consequences of that rejection. The consequences of what Avalokiteshvara saw. So we read, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Again, very strange and kind of paradoxical claims here. Scholar Donald Lopez calls this the most famous and the most problematic section of the text, and again it starts right at the beginning. He terms it the fourfold profundity. Now we should note here that the claim is not that form is empty, but that form is emptiness, which is slightly different. Now there's a huge commentarial literature on all of this, so I can only in this video scratch the surface, but I want to give you a flavor. One example is in Prashastrasena's commentary. When he talks about form is emptiness, what he says is that this is supposed to be an antidote to clinging to samsara through clinging to forms. That is, forms are nothing more than emptiness, so we should not cling to them. But emptiness as form, on the other hand, has a quite different message. This, he says, is an antidote to falling into the extreme of nirvana for the Shravakas. Well, what does that mean? Well, Shravakas are the hearers or disciples, those people who heard the teachings from the Buddha and taught it to others. So what Prashastrasena is saying here is that this particular part of the Heart Sutra is supposed to get us away from some of the teachings of early Buddhism that have been transmitted to us by these disciples. There's some difference, there's some disagreement on this character of nirvana, which we'll get to in a bit. Red Pine looks at Chinese commentator Te Ching, who lived in the 16th and 17th century. And here, Te Ching says that form is not separate from emptiness, is once again supposed to get us away from our tendency to cling to forms because they're nothing more than emptiness. But when we get to the alternate, emptiness is not separate from form, he says, this statement destroys the view of annihilation held by followers of the lesser path, or Hinayana, who don't give rise to the thought of saving others, but sink into emptiness and quietude and drown in the stillness of nirvana. Now, one major difference between the so-called lesser path of early Buddhism and the so-called greater path of the Mahayana and Prajnaparamita has to do with this character of nirvana. I did a video on this a while back, and I'll leave a link to that down below if you want to hear more about it. But basically the idea here is that in the early Buddhist Dharma, once one attained nirvana and then passed away, one no longer was able to be active in the world. The status of the enlightened being after death was indeed one of the unanswered questions. Such a being neither existed, nor did not exist, nor both, nor neither. However, in the Dharma of the newly ascendant Mahayana, on the other hand, Buddhas were able to continue to be active in the world. And so these passages saying emptiness is form, and emptiness is not separate from form, are intended to express this new view of the ability to be active in the world by Buddhas, at least according to these early commentators. Another way of looking at these profundities can be as explained by scholar Donald Lopez, who says, the general position expressed by the Indian commentators in explaining the fourfold profundity is that form is emptiness, in the sense that emptiness is the final nature of form, and that emptiness is form, in that emptiness is not to be discovered apart from form. Now, this interpretation of this profundity would make the distinction between these two ideas as ones between, we might say, metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics being a description of the way things are, at their depth and their essence, and epistemology being the way that we know how things are. So form is emptiness in a metaphysical or ontological sense, in the sense that emptiness is form's final nature. However, emptiness is form in an epistemological sense, in the sense that we know about emptiness through our experience of form. And then in the second section, which I'm terming the recapitulation section, this claim is extended to all of the other aggregates, indeed all other dharmas of any kind. It's said that they are all defined by emptiness. They're not born nor destroyed, they're not purified nor defiled, they're not complete nor deficient. One profound apparent implication here is that the key central aspect of Buddhist Dharma, that all things change, is overturned. Since there is no creation nor destruction, change becomes impossible. Since there's no purification nor defilement, the path becomes impossible. Now we'll return to all of these kinds of claims in the next section. So now we turn to the third section, which begins with an apparent contradiction, self-contradiction. Whereas earlier on the sutra had said that form is emptiness, now it says, in emptiness there is no form. This is a significant difference in exposition all of a sudden. What are we supposed to do with this difference? Well, scholar Donald Lopez once again talks about how in the orthodox Tibetan Prasangika Madhyamaka view, which is probably the orthodox Tibetan view, this section is to be understood as referring to self-existent form. That is to say, the words self-existent, svabhava, are implied in this exposition, even though they're not stated here, because they were stated earlier on in the sutra. That is, what this means to say is that in emptiness there is no self-existent form, or form with svabhava. However, since that term is not explicitly stated in the sutra, in this section, either the section is open to significant misinterpretation, or perhaps the Tibetan view is questionable. In any event, this clearly is a very explosive claim and an explosive section. It begins with a classical list of dharmas from the Abhidharma, such as the aggregates, the sense organs, the sense bases, and so on, and says that none of these exist in emptiness. It then goes on to say that there's no causal link from ignorance to old age and death. That is to say, there's no dependent origination. It goes on to say that there's no suffering, no source, no relief, no path. That is to say, there are no Four Noble Truths. Then it goes on, no knowledge, no attainment, and no non-attainment. That is, there's nothing to know, nothing to attain, nothing not to have yet attained. That is, there's no path of practice. And as we've already seen, there is no change. Now, it may very well be, as the Tibetan Prasangika Madhyamaka says, that all of these are to be understood as encompassing the idea of self-existence. That is, there's no self-existent Four Noble Truths. There's no self-existent dependent origination. There's no self-existent path. Now, that may have been the aim of the 2nd and 3rd century Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna when he was trying to discuss the very same kinds of topics. That is, to try to uproot misinterpretations of these central Dharmic Buddhist concepts. If that was all that this text was trying to do, however, then we might expect it to go on to reaffirm such Dharmic concepts without the notion of svabhava, or self-existence. We might expect the Heart Sutra to go on to say, but there is Four Noble Truths without self-existence. There is dependent origination without self-existence, and so on. But the text does not do that. Indeed, taken at face value, the sutra simply says that in emptiness these things do not exist. And so the early dharma of the Shravakas, of the disciples, simply collapses. Now we turn to the 4th paragraph, this second result, which also in its own way seems to undermine this position that the only thing this text is trying to do is to eliminate the Sarvastivada Abhidharma notion of self-existence from these concepts and otherwise not make any real change. Here again, Avalokiteshvara is describing things to the Buddha's foremost disciple Sariputta, who remains ignorant. Avalokiteshvara says, "Therefore, Shariputra, without attainment, bodhisattvas take refuge in prajna paramita." They don't take refuge in the typical early Buddhist dharmic notions of, for example, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, dependent origination, and so on. The prajna paramita supersedes all of these earlier ideas, all of this earlier wisdom. All Buddhas, past, present, and future, also take refuge in prajna paramita and realize unexcelled perfect enlightenment. That is, all Buddhas are understood to have become enlightened through the prajna paramita. Now, why would this have sounded surprising at the time that it was composed? Because at that time it would have been understood that all of these Buddhas attained enlightenment through the more traditional kinds of path factors or path practices of early Buddhism, through the Eightfold Path, through understanding the Four Noble Truths, through understanding dependent origination, through uprooting craving and attaining nirvana. But as Red Pine says in commenting on this section, Buddhas become Buddhas by taking refuge in prajna paramita and not by attaining nirvana. So now we turn to the final section of the sutra, the mantra section. And this begins with a number of claims, in particular that this mantra heals all suffering and is true, not false. Now, there are 2 claims here, and I'm going to deal with them one after the other. The first claim is that this mantra heals all suffering. Now, in the Buddha's path, at least up until this point, it was understood, at least the Buddha seems to have said, that all that he taught was suffering and its end. That is, that the traditional Buddhist, early Buddhist path of the Shravakas was the one that would end suffering. In this poem, however, in this sutra, what we're being told is that the mantra ends suffering. Second,
this claim that the mantra is true and not false suggests that the mantra itself takes the place of the Four Noble Truths. It is what is true, not the Noble Truths. It sort of becomes a substitute for them. Now, there is some scholarly disagreement about the status of this mantra. Donald Lopez, a scholar, a great scholar of this material, believes that it may be the mantra section of the sutra may be a later interpolation during the rise of Tantric Buddhism from the 7th to the 13th centuries of the Common Era, and may not originally have been included in the sutra. He believes that this mantra may be understood to be a kind of a secret teaching, in that it's somewhat obscure and needs direct understanding. It has a hidden meaning of a kind. On the other hand, scholar Red Pine does not believe that this is a secret mantra because, as he describes it, secret mantras only become efficacious when they're transmitted in particular kinds of ritualized tantric ceremonies, and this particular mantra doesn't seem to have that kind of restriction. And he cites a couple of Chinese commentators to the effect that this mantra is not intended for intellectual understanding, but only for repetition. It is, he says, the secret language of the Buddhas. Now, all of that said, what are we to make of this sutra in the greater history of Buddhist ideas? How does it fit into the history of the Buddhist Dharma, and how are we to understand it in that context? In my next video, I will go into some of how I understand it fitting into this greater historical picture. And when that video is ready, I will leave a link to it up here on the screen. Meanwhile, if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you in that next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.